This is a continuation of what I talked about in the last video, which is the birth of MK Ultra. And this information, like that in the previous video that I did on this topic, is taken primarily from Dr. Colin Ross's book, The CIA Doctors, Human Rights Violations by American Psychiatrists. And that was published in 2006, but it was originally published as Bluebird, Deliberate Creation of Multiple Personality by Psychiatrists, and that was published in 2000. MK Ultra was created by the CIA on April 3, 1953. Both Projects Artichoke and Bluebird were incorporated into MK Ultra, even though Artichoke continued until 1955. MK Ultra was eventually rolled over into MK Search on June 7, 1964, and ran until June 1972. MK Ultra and MK Search files were ordered shredded by the director of the CIA in 1972, Richard Helms. Not all documents were shredded, however, and those that survived can be obtained through a Freedom of Information request from the CIA. It is important to note, however, that the documents are heavily redacted, with personal names whited out, with a few exceptions. One of the exceptions is Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA officer who ran MK Ultra from inside the CIA's Technical Services Division. A book has been written about Gottlieb recently called Poisoner in Chief, and I will cover that in separate videos. The documents contained in MK Ultra files include correspondence and internal CIA memos, financial information, copies of canceled checks and invoices. Some files also contain descriptions of grant funding proposals and literature reviews. MK Ultra was divided into 149 sub-projects and MK Search into 7 sub-projects. Dr. Ross's book contains details about these in appendices in his book. He includes accounts of personal communications that he had with Dr. Gottlieb going back to 1994. According to Dr. Ross, Gottlieb said that MK Ultra had several components and goals. One was to establish relationships with individual contractors so they could act as consultants on CIA projects. Another purpose was to fund various types of exploratory research, especially with regard to chemical and biological weapons and how supplies of these might be obtained. One of the sub-projects involved the development and testing of mind control drugs. These drugs would be utilized in interrogations and to induce amnesia in subjects. This group of sub-projects overlapped with those on chemical warfare. Another area of experimentation had to do with research and use of non-chemical mind control or psychological warfare techniques. These projects included studies of social psychology, group psychology, psychotherapy, hypnosis, and sleep and sensory deprivation. Most of the contractors who conducted these experiments were unwitting. That is, they did not realize the research money funding their projects came from the CIA, because the CIA used front organizations for this purpose. One of the most shocking aspects of the MK Ultra program was its work on hypnotic mind control and efforts to create hypnotic couriers, the so-called Manchurian Candidate. This work was carried out by Alden Sears at the University of Denver and the University of Minnesota under sub-projects 5, 25, 29, and 49. Sears had top secret clearance and signed a CIA secrecy agreement. The documents examined by Dr. Ross state that the legislation controlling this secrecy agreement was the Espionage Act of June 15, 1917. Dr. Gottlieb's name is not redacted from the documents. There is a memo dated April 20, 1954 that details an observation by Gottlieb and a CIA officer of hypnosis experiments that were conducted. According to Dr. Ross, Alden Sears was never able to create a full Manchurian Candidate, but in a proposal under Sub-Project 40, Sears says this: "Since this research was started in September of 1952, work has been done on various projects which were outlined by the fund representative and myself. Some of these have been," and then it's whited out. "These two have been published," whited out, and various pilot studies concerning subconscious retention of material and ability to deliver same without the subjects knowing consciously that he even had this material, i.e. an unwitting message carrier. In order to investigate the possibilities of hypnotic induction of non-willing subjects who have only a knowledge of some other language than that of the hypnotist, an investigation should be made into non-verbal induction techniques, such as long duration of monotonous audio or visual stimulation. A variation of this, in which I am interested and in which I have done some work, a few pilot studies, is to use soft, restful music in which my voice was also recorded at a subliminal level. With some subjects in the past, this has been very effective. Can auto-hypnosis be taught so as to be as effective as hetero-hypnosis in the canceling out of pain or other stress conditions? I.e., if this can be done, a person could create his own world and be happy in it, even though he were actually confined in a very small place, which was extremely filthy. There are a great many areas which need investigation in the field of hypnosis. However, some of these, especially those connected with the use of drugs, could not be handled in the university situation. MKUltra Subproject 136 was approved for funding in 1961 and also dealt with the creation of a Manchurian candidate. The deliberate creation of multiple personality in children is explicitly stated in the proposal submitted in the request for funding of this subproject. Dr. Ross says that while MKUltra received the most public attention of any of the CIA and military mind control programs, most of its sub-programs were relatively benign compared to what was carried out in Projects Often and MK Naomi. There were, however, many other CIA mind control programs. One of these was Project Stargate. Project Stargate was run in cooperation with the U.S. military. The purpose of this project was to investigate remote viewing and to identify applications for its use in espionage. Along with a number of other experiments in extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, remote viewing was developed in the 1970s as part of the U.S. Cold War-era covert intelligence program. Remote viewing is the ability to perceive information and imagery about objects and people that are remote or far away by using ESP, in other words, by seeing with the mind. Applications included spying on military facilities behind enemy lines and the location of missing aircraft, personnel, fugitives, and hostages. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union spied on each other using the abilities of psychic remote viewers. The object was to gather intelligence information of military significance. There were two complementary components to the U.S. remote viewing program. A research program on anomalous cognition, or AC, directed initially by physicists Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at the laboratories of Stanford Research International at Menlo Park, California, which was shifted in 1988 to Science Applications International Corporation under the direction of Edwin May. The findings of their early studies have been reported in prestigious scientific journals during the 1970s. And B, mission-oriented operational assignments overseen by various intelligence agencies of the U.S. government, codenamed Project Stargate. Information regarding this top-secret program was partly declassified by the CIA in July 1995, following the thaw in the Cold War. Since then, several research articles and many books have been published by some of the persons who were closely associated with this program. The program was defunded in 1995, and remote viewers involved in the government program today give workshops for civilian purposes such as industrial espionage. It has been alleged that active intelligence personnel secretly conducted military-trained psychics for information following the 9/11 attacks. Another CIA mind control program was MK Naomi. This was a joint program of the CIA and the Army Special Operations Division in Fort Detrick, Maryland, and it ran from 1953 to 1970. The object of MK Naomi was to develop, test, and maintain biological agents and delivery systems for use against humans as well as against animals and crops. The CIA also carried out LSD experiments as part of MK Ultra. LSD was discovered in 1943 by Dr. Albert Hofmann. Hofmann was a chemist who worked at Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland, and he was investigating ergo alkaloids. Accidentally, Hofmann ingested some of the compound he was working on, and this induced a psychedelic experience. Very quickly, Sandoz Laboratories became the major supplier of LSD in the world. The CIA obtained a supply of LSD from Eli Lilly in 1953 through MK Ultra Subproject 18. The CIA paid $400,000, and through this subproject, Eli Lilly became the first North American manufacturer and distributor of LSD. What did the CIA use this LSD for? In an U.S. Army memorandum dated July 15, 1975, it was revealed that at least 1,500 soldiers were given LSD without informed consent as part of Army mind control experiments. Also, many leading American psychiatrists were among the first to take LSD. Dr. Ross discusses some of these, including several who conducted experiments with LSD. He says in one of these experiments, LSD or psilocybin was given to 50 boys aged 7 to 15. The children took the hallucinogens daily for weeks or months at a time at a very high dosage level of 150 micrograms. Some of these child subjects received LSD daily for a year or more. In another study, children were given LSD who were only 6 to 12 years old. According to Dr. Ross, these experiments were discussed at meetings of the Society for Biological Psychiatry, and they were published in the medical literature. The CIA also sponsored LSD research through MK Ultra and also financed LSD conferences and books. MK Ultra Subproject 142, which Dr. Ross includes in Appendix C of his book, describes the control of animals through the implantation of brain electrodes and the use of these animals for the delivery of biological and chemical weapons. The overall goal was to, quote, control the mind and behavior and to create dissociation through a combination of drugs, sensory isolation, hypnosis, brain electrode implants, electric shock, and beaming different kinds of energy at the brain. The ability to create limited, controlled amnesia through a variety of methods as a primary goal of the mind control programs, end quote. A memorandum dated May 22, 1962, relating to Subproject 142 states, the reason for separating this work financially from the other efforts of White It Out in the agency's behalf is to allow him to engage in some very practical experiments at some point in the work, which would present security problems if this effort were handled in the usual way. Some of the uses proposed for these particular animals would involve possible delivery systems for biological warfare, chemical warfare agents, or for direct executive action type operations, as distinguished from the eavesdropping application of White It Out. And Dr. Ross explains that executive action type operations means human assassination. While there are no declassified documents that show that human subjects were used in brain electrode experiments, Dr. Jose Delgado, a neurosurgeon and professor at Yale, received funding for brain electrode research on children and adults. These research grants included investigations into neurological mechanisms in epilepsy and in group behavior. One of the brain electrode patients at Massachusetts General Hospital was described as a 14-year-old girl who was brought up in a foster home and was of borderline intelligence. The researchers, Mark and Irvin, say that on 2 separate occasions, her violent behavior resulted in the death of a young foster sibling, and she subsequently assaulted a 7-year-old child at the state hospital where she was confined. Depth electrodes were placed in each amygdala through the posterior approach. Dr. Ross describes other patients who were named in the studies carried out by Mark and Irvin. He noted that several of the patients may have had an undiagnosed psychologically based dissociative disorder that contributed to their violent behaviors. He says that an 18-year-old patient is shown in the book Violence in the Brain, and this is the book published in 1970 detailing the results of these studies. This young woman was shown in photos in the book either smiling, angry, or pounding the wall, depending on which button is being pushed on the transmitter box that sends signals to her brain's electrodes. Another psychiatrist who did extensive research on subjects with implanted brain electrodes was Dr. Robert G Heath, chairman of the Department of Psychiatry and Neurology at Tulane University in New Orleans from 1979 to 1980. Dr. Heath's area of expertise involves subjects with implanted brain electrodes who had hallucinogens introduced directly into their brains. The hallucinogenic drugs included LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and a substance he called taraxine, which he extracted from the blood of patients diagnosed with schizophrenia. Dr. Heath's work was described in Senate testimony given on September 10, 1975, by Charles D. Abelard, General Counsel, Department of the Army. Brain electrode research was also conducted on prisoners at Louisiana State Penitentiary and on schizophrenic patients. In an even more bizarre application of the brain electrode technique, Dr. Heath attempted to use it to treat what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 3 at that time, we're now on volume 3, or I'm sorry, we're now on volume 5, so volume 3 was 1980. So what the DSM-3 at the time termed ego-dystonic homosexuality. In other words, the idea was to change an individual's sexual preference. Dr. Ross quotes extensively from the document that explains how this was to be achieved. Here is part of what it said. At this time, the patient was maintaining an active interest in females, culminating in an expressed desire to attempt heterosexual activity in the near future. Therefore, arrangements were made for a 21-year-old prostitute to spend 2 hours with him in a laboratory specially prepared to afford complete privacy. On the afternoon of their meeting, the patient's electrodes were attached to an electroencephalograph via an extension cord for increased mobility, and recordings were obtained for 45 minutes with an interruption for delivery of passive stimulation of the septal region for 20 seconds. I won't go into the rest of the text because it gets rather explicit, but needless to say, at the end, the document notes that during 11 months of follow-up, the individual maintained a primarily heterosexual orientation. Women were also subjected to Dr. Heath's experiments. He brought women to orgasm by electrical stimulation of electrodes that he implanted in their brains. What I found reprehensible when I read this was that one experimental subject was described as a 34-year-old woman of borderline defective intelligence who had a 6th grade education. To end this segment, I'd like to review some important conclusions reached by Dr. Ross that he relays at the end of the book. Dr. Ross is an expert on dissociative identity disorder. This was formerly called multiple personality disorder. Dr. Ross says there are 4 pathways to dissociative identity disorder. DID may arise as a natural response to severe, chronic childhood abuse, which may include any combination of physical, sexual, emotional, and verbal abuse. It may be a response to severe, chronic childhood neglect. It may be a factitious disorder, that is, the symptoms are created by the person. And lastly, DID may be iatrogenic, which means created by a doctor or therapist. In civilian therapies, iatrogenic dissociative identity is created unwittingly and it's malpractice. But in Manchurian candidate programs, it is created on purpose. Manchurian candidate programs were designed to create psychiatric disorders. Therefore, Dr. Ross concludes they are harmful, unethical, and violate human rights. And this brings me to another whole topic of trauma-based mind control, which I believe I will cover in a separate series of videos, because this series is going to continue discussing U.S. foreign policy, and I'm going to be going into how these tactics were used during the Cold War for espionage purposes.